The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
After leaving the mountain, Jesus and his disciples made their way through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know because he was instructing his disciples. He was telling them, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. They will put him to death. And 3 days after he has been put to death, he will rise again. But they did not understand him, what he said, and was afraid to ask him. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" They said nothing, because they had been arguing which of them was the greatest. So he sat down, called the 12 to him, and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must make himself at last of all and servant of all." He then took a little child, set him in front of them, put his arms around the child, and said to them, "Anyone who welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
A very good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Father.
To step into today's Gospel, the scene of today's Gospel, I need to take you back to last week's Gospel. We were at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus needed to know the perception, the vision of his disciples and the crowds about him. And the question was on, who am I? And if you remember, he asked what the crowds and the others thought of him, and they gave him different answers. And then he looked at the disciples and says, "Who do you say I am?" And as we know, Peter made that great profession of faith. And then Jesus told the disciples and Peter what was ahead of them: the passion, the death, the fulfillment. And as we know, Peter was trying to remonstrate with Jesus, and Jesus was getting a bit disturbed. He says, "Get behind me, Peter, get behind me." Because the way you think, the way you perceive, your vision, Peter, is of a human person, not of God. The way you see things is not of God, it is of humanity. Today we have the continuation of that epic story, and we are at Capernaum. We are moving to Capernaum. And in the midst of that journey towards Capernaum, Jesus once again is enlightening them on what lies ahead. Simply the death, the passion, the persecution, the betrayal, everything that was going to unfold in Jerusalem. He was speaking to disciples, but they didn't understand, as scripture tells us, and they were having an argument. And Jesus sensed that they were having an argument, and the moment they reached the home, Jesus turned and asked them, "What were you guys fighting about on the road? What were you arguing about on the road?" And there was a stillness of silence again, because they were arguing, who is the greatest? Who is the greatest? Who's the best? Who is simply the best? You know, who is the top? Who is ahead of others? They say that in humanity, in each one of us, or in humanity in general, there are two kinds of people that are never happy in life. Two kinds of people. One is those who continuously complain in life, who are just complaining and complaining in life. They have never-ending stories of complaint. They're continuously complaining and complaining, never happy. And the second kind of people that you find is people who compare one another. And they compare, keep comparing. And they think that I'm the best. No, I'm the best. You know, what I can do, you can't do. Complaints and compare. And that's what was happening on that road to Capernaum. They were arguing among themselves, who is the greatest? Let's be honest to ourselves this morning. Deep down in humanity, in all of us, at some corner, lies this in the subconscious of our mind, or at some part of our human life journey. They say that when you speak about the human servanthood, the greatest obstacle is self. The greatest enemy of servanthood is the self. If I take that word self out and I just put the word ego, you'll feel at home. Because for anything that is about a human relationship, the greatest struggle is about the ego. It's a passion that drives us inside, that ego. And it's a very poisonous passion, my dear friends, this ego or self. It destroys a lot of relationships. It destroys friendships. Because sometimes this ego is how the world evolves around us. Everything spins around that ego, that self. And it's a very dangerous thing, because when we look at this danger of this ego, of this self, this great enemy that lies within us, that we eat and sleep with, and have that inner conversation with ourselves, we can kind of become indifferent to others. We tell ourselves, I don't need you. I can manage it on my own. I'm way ahead. That's self. It's a competitive thing that is in us, you know. Who's the greatest boxer? Who's the greatest musician? Who's the greatest orator? Who's the greatest sportsman? Everyone wants to be on the pinnacle, on the pedestal of life, holding on to that gold and not the silver or the bronze. It's a competitive part of our lives. From a very young age of life, it's been instilled in us, it's been ingrained in us, this enemy of the ego that in us. And as we move on in life, I find this, that people who build on this self-ego can be very critical of others. Can be very critical of others. Because I feel deep down at myself the insecurity that lies in us. And so what we do is we begin to become indifferent, and we begin to compare ourselves with others. It's a passion that dominates us. In the study of spirituality and in psycho-spiritual, when you begin to dwell on this self, this ego, in relationships, in ministries, in mission, in family life, in your work, whatever you're doing, this self, this ego, there's a beautiful word that comes out in this psycho-spiritual word. It's called self-will. The temptation of the self-will. The temptation of the self-will. It's a moment when you begin to exert and exalt yourself all the more in life. If you take a moment and you look at the temptations of Jesus in the desert, just as he was about to begin his ministry, he was led into the desert and he was tempted. And if you could recall the three temptations of Jesus: turning stone to bread, standing on the parapet of the temple, and looking down and falling off and bowing before the evil one, and all these things will be given to you. When you begin to study each of the temptations of Jesus in the gospel and in humanity, it's all about power, passion of power, greed, prestige and honor, and most importantly, it's about power. It's all there in the context of the temptation of the desert. Because in life today, as you and I move on gracefully each day, there is this great temptation somewhere lurking in us to be relevant. Nobody wants to be irrelevant in the world today. Somebody wants to be a special person somewhere. We call this specialization in life. Everybody wants to be relevant. Everybody wants to be a performer in life. And sometimes we have a very high opinion of ourselves when we look at others. When we begin to look at others today. As I said to you, there's a sense of great competition in the world today. You know, I've always made this blunt statement. Nobody wants to be a zero. Everybody wants to be a hero in life. Nobody wants to be a zero. All want to be a hero. And this whole thing is what Jesus was talking about. Who am I? Who am I before the world? This great temptation of the self-will that lies in us. And when you begin to study deeper into this whole experience of one who's tempted by the self-will in the temptation of Jesus, and Jesus speaking about who is the greatest, that was a subject that they were arguing on the way. Sometimes one can lead to individualism. People who have this temptation of self-will, they don't need others around them. That's the sense of indifference towards other. This sense of individualism that draws them and leads them, that drives them in life. You know, again, I call people of such nature sendirian berhad. They just do it on their own. They don't need the community. They don't need anyone in the team. Sendirian berhad. It's all me, Father. I have done it. I have done it. And the funny thing is that they tell themselves they can't do it without me. They need me. The self-will. Because the intentions and the motivation that lies within you is simply to go solo. Let's go solo. You know, they are not into a team, and they would rather play the game without anyone. Just one. And the third most painful part from this performance of relevancy to the experience of individualism, gradually it builds into a power. It builds into a power. They hold on to that position, and they hold on to that power, and they can't let it go. It's a gradual process in the temptations of the self-will. Because it's a position of life that one seeks. It's standing from the above and looking down to the below of humanity. And yet, John the Baptist says, he must increase and I must decrease. He must increase and I must decrease. The question we asked this morning, in all honesty, where does it stem from? All this thing, this temptation of power, of performance, of relevancy, of ambition, of becoming an individual, of comparing oneself and building on that ego. James tells us in the second reading today, if you've been listening to it, he says everything in this life stems from within. It's just inside you. Don't look for it outside. Don't blame the structures. Don't blame the parish priest. Don't blame the community. Don't blame anyone. It's just within you. That's that thirst and hunger for each one of us. As I said to you, it's a passion of humanity that drives us. It's a poison that lies within. And James was reminding everyone today of what lied in them. From the abundance of the heart, it comes out. I like the text. Jesus says it's from within. Evil, jealousy, anger, bitterness, fornication, adultery. He went on the list in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. And he said that it's all from within. James tells us this: when you pray and you don't get it, examine your intentions. Everything is from within, that temptation of self-will. And Jesus had to address this to his disciples very much at the initial stage of their discipleship. He knew what was in their minds and in their hearts. And he said, it's time to change, guys. It's time to change. And so what he did was to take a little child, just a little child, and he put it in front of them, and he says, anyone who welcomes one of these little kids welcomes me. And the one who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Childlike trust. What's so significant about this childlike? the innocence of that child. When I sat back and I look at the many children, kids that I have encountered and played with, and I see the innocence of that child before humanity, I find that there's a sense of, number one, dependency. When they're hungry, they cry. It's a sense of dependency. They need a hug, they cry for that hug. There's something that's always about a dependency in them. I spoke at length the past days and weeks about poor in spirit, the dependency, the childlike trust. That's the abandonment. It's not about me, it's what I need in God. That's the dependency. The second thing that I could think of when I look at the child is the purity of heart, the innocence of that heart. Now, some of you saying, Father, are you very sure? I'm looking at it in a very general way, not in a subjective manner. Children are innocents. They might quarrel, they may say things, it's without an agenda. They grab. It's just an innocence of childlike trust and purity of heart. You could see they will be forgiving. There are many things that you could just look at your kids who are around you, who are little ones, and you could find a lot in them. They say that's about 58 times Jesus spoke about children in the Gospels. Quite a bit about childlike. Somewhere deep down in each one of us, including myself, there is a passion, there is a drive. Who is the greatest? And sometimes we need to step back and just look within ourselves, where it stems out, how it stems out, but most importantly, where it's stemming from. This competitive agenda, this power that we grapple with, prestige and honor and status and ego. Jesus invites us to just find ourselves before others with the simple words of John the Baptist. He must increase and I must decrease. He must increase and I must decrease.